Okay, so to start this podcast, we've done a lot of war movies.
We haven't done a lot of war movies.
We've done a lot of war movies.
We've done several.
And we're probably going to do a lot more. But a big criticism of this war movie was the cheesy or campy dialogue, okay?
Yeah.
So I wanted to put that to the test a little bit. So what I did was I got quotes from both this movie as well as the last war movie we did. Do you remember what movie that was?
Probably Hacksaw Ridge.
No, it was 1917.
1917. You're right.
I know I'm right. So anyway, I got quotes from both of them, and what you need to do is to determine which movie it's from. It should be easy because you should remember quotes from this movie, but we don't.
I would hope so.
So I tried to pick quotes that did not have any defining things, didn't talk about certain countries or time periods or things like that.
Oh, that'll make it more difficult.
I attempted. So, anyway,
got it.
You ready?
Yeah.
So, first quote. There is only one way this war ends. Last man standing.
1917.
Correct? Wow. I don't care if he consults coffee grounds while doing the boogie woogie as long as the intel is good.
This movie.
What is?
This is Midway.
Yes, there you go. Hold on. I'm sorry about your friend. May I tell you something you probably already know? It doesn't do to dwell on it.
1917.
Dang it, man. You've got them all. Yikes. I guess I'm not going to trick you, huh?
Probably not.
If you know that you came through when people were counting on you, you'll be able to face anything.
Midway.
Yep. Jesus. I guess every battle needs a miracle.
This movie. Midway.
Good God. I hope today might be a good day. Hope is a dangerous thing.
This movie. Midway.
No.
Damn.
1917. Damn. And that was the last one. And
okay.
I gotcha. Woo! So anyway, I wanted to do that just because a lot of these quotes were very similar.
Well, so that's fair. And then in a lot of war movies, there's at least one or two really campy things.
Now, do you think you would have got them as well if there was time passed between seeing this movie and 1917? Both of them. Like, you didn't just see one
probably
a day ago.
Not. I would have done much worse if I hadn't literally just seen one of them.
Okay. So that was the point. I just kind of wanted to show that the dialogue is often similar in these war movies.
Well, I mean, in one of the well-regarded movies about war, there's a quote about, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
Right.
Like, or this one's for Pearl Harbor. Like, okay, we got it. Pearl Harbor was a big thing.
Yeah. So there is a lot of... So we'll get into the dialogue, but I did want to do that. So this movie that we picked was Midway.
And
why did you pick it?
Audience recommend. It's actually been on my list forever.
And who recommended it?
Krista. Mm-hmm. Favorite listener.
Okay. We got a little flack for saying that out loud, so, be careful with your favorites there.
I mean, there's a close second for a few people.
But you just... Never divulged that.
There's also a runaway favorite for least favorite.
Well,
so
different ones for different strokes for different folks.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we picked Midway. I'm Shay.
I'm Tyler.
This is cinematically correct. So, do we want to get into your beer before we move into anything too movie specific?
So I do have a beer. It's actually not a beer. It's a cider.
Pardon me.
It's California Ace. America's Best.
Okay, and what was the reason that you picked it? Because again, he has been picking these beers while quarantine is going on.
We actually decided on it together because I sent you pictures from the liquor store.
Okay,
fair. You picked it for America's Best, which I didn't even realize. I picked it up for Ace, which is a fighter pilot term.
Okay.
I don't believe Dick Best was in fact an ace, but he did a different role in the military. He has a different record of being the only pilot to hit 2 different aircraft carriers on the same day.
And he is America's Best.
His literal name is Best.
So there we go. That was not as satisfying.
No.
It's kind of a bummer. I really feel like we need to start rating the cap pull-off, The satisfying...
The can crack or the bottle top open.
Yeah, we really need to add that into our rating.
I mean, that's very sweet because it's a honey cider. Not bad, but it's
sweet.
It's kind of overly sweet. You know, it's like that.
I'm not a fan of the super
It's like
sweet.
that sickly sweet almost.
So your stomach ain't gonna feel too good very soon.
No, I mean it's not bad. It's definitely better than some of the ones we've tried.
I mean the bar is low on that.
Some of the ones that we've tried for this podcast, I have suffered for my art.
But in some of them, you've actually been pleasantly surprised.
That's fair. That's entirely
So, okay. So we're going to do cast. Now, I will say to start off this podcast, a lot of this podcast is going to be heavily relied on Tyler. 1, he's seen more war movies than me. 2, he knows more history than I. There's a lot of that, so expect to hear a lot of Tyler's voice. So this is including the cast, because while I recognize some people, I feel like you know them better.
I would think that's probably fair.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you even want to pick who we go through? Because there's a lot of characters in this movie, and they're not all important.
I mean, there are a lot of them. Let's go down the list. So, Ed Skrein, Dick Best.
Yes.
Deadpool, he's the villain.
Alita Battle Angel.
We've already done it for the podcast.
Right. And he's one of 2 actors in this movie who is from Alita Battle Angel. So.
Yes. So, yeah, he's an up-and-coming actor. I think he's more recent than a lot of the well-established actors we've done for different movies in the podcast.
Yeah, and he plays in this movie.
He plays Dick Best, the title character, basically. He's the main protagonist for the whole movie. And you follow his journey through Midway.
Right.
The next is Patrick Wilson, who plays Edwin Layton. So he's kind of the behind-the-scenes orchestrator of Midway. So he's the intelligence officer that discovers that they're planning to attack Midway. And the only thing that I really know him from is Watchmen, I believe.
Yeah, I've never seen Watchmen. I don't know him from anything, literally. I mean, he looked super familiar to me when I saw him, but Hard Candy I've definitely seen and he's in, which is a really good movie. And if you've not seen it...
I think he's the villain in Hard Candy.
That's rough. Insidious, I think I've seen, but I'm not sure. The Conjuring I've definitely seen. Annabelle, this looks like the second Annabelle, though. Annabelle Comes Home, yeah. Yep. So we have some struggles about Annabelle, so let's just not get into that on the podcast, but you know. So yeah, he's been in a few movies, but nothing that really stands out to me as things I've seen.
Then Luke Evans is Wade McCluskey.
You're skipping? You're skipping people?
I am skipping.
Valid people, but okay.
I'm going straight to Luke Evans because he's my tie to Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
So he was in Three Musketeers, which was done in 2011. There's been several Musketeer movies, but this is one of them.
Okay.
I think that's the nicest thing you can say about it. It's one of those movies. With Orlando Bloom, who is in Lord of the Rings.
Ah, got you. Okay.
So Wade McCluskey is one of the other pivotal characters. He's basically Dick Best's boss for most of the movie. He's trying to keep him in line, really.
But if you can't beat him, join him.
Join him, turn into a cowboy, and do some crazy things. Woody Harrelson.
This is... Well, we've definitely at least done one Woody Harrelson movie because we did Zombieland. I feel like we did more than one because I want to say... I was going to say Bonnie and Clyde. Yep. So, yeah. So we've definitely done Woody Harrelson. We love him.
Oh, he's a fantastic actor.
Yes, he is. And in this movie, he plays a serious role, which was very hard for me at the beginning.
He does. He plays Admiral Chester Nimitz.
Now, I think he probably has done a lot of serious roles. I am not used to it. I always expect him to break out into some type of humor. So I think I need to see a few more serious movies of his to kind of get myself used to it. Because at first I was just like, I can't take him seriously. This is really hard. Yeah.
So Admiral Nimitz is very well known for his role in World War II and helping beat back the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, because we had been basically sucker punched and we were at the start of the war fighting from behind because they'd been fighting a war for quite a while and they had already built out their military. Then Mandy Moore, which was thrown in as Ann Best, who is Dick Best's wife.
Yeah. I do need to mention that she's my Gilmore Girls reference.
Of course. I figured that was probably...
Well, she is on This Is Us, and she is the wife of Milo Ventimiglia, who is Jess from Gilmore Girls. And yes, I'm Team Jess. Like, nobody has to ask that question. But yeah. So she was an easy one to pick, so I just kind of went with that.
I'm going to throw this out there. I'm happy to end this stupid competition at any time for the sake of our listeners.
Because it's harder for you than it is for me?
No, because our listeners don't appreciate it, and I'm just doing this out of spite, really, because you're doing Gilmore Girls out of spite in the first place.
I don't know if you can say all our listeners don't appreciate it. I, for one, know that many of our listeners enjoy Gilmore Girls. Just because your manly listeners don't, it's not my problem. But anyway, so Mandy Moore plays the wife. There is some discussion online of whether or not that was needed, but we'll get into that. But I liked her character. And then the rest of them, I mean, there's a lot, right? I did want to give an honorable mention to Kean Johnson because he is the other Alita Battle Angel person.
Right.
But other than that, is there anybody else you wanted to cover?
There's Dennis Quaid, Bull Halsey. He was portrayed very favorably in this movie for the most part. I have conflicting feelings about other things that he did later in the war, but Aaron Eckhart, James Doolittle, or Jimmy Doolittle, very well known for the Doolittle Raid, which we'll get into later.
And the actor's very well known for being Harvey Dent.
Yeah, Harvey Dent. We've done a podcast on him already. So there's a bunch of big name actors in here. Yeah,
I mean, Nick Jonas is in here, which I didn't realize was Nick Jonas. I kept saying, that guy is so familiar. But then I read his name, and I'm like, whoa, I did not know Nick Jonas was an actor.
Yeah, I actually liked his character in this movie.
I did too.
And horrible things happened.
Yes.
Spoilers.
They did.
All right, so okay. Moving on.
So we should say, since you said spoilers, there is going to be a lot of spoilers in this, and we're going to be talking about the real life attack versus the movie itself. So,
I mean, can there really be spoilers if this happened in the 1940s?
I mean,
like, it actually happened, and it's recorded in history. Like, how are there spoilers?
I don't know. And if you listen to our podcast, you know everything has spoilers, but yeah. I just, anyway, since you said it. So, okay. We are very well aware that a lot of people did not enjoy this movie. So I want to say that we went into this movie knowing that was the case because we got some tweets about that when we announced we were doing this movie. Yeah. So
that is fair. I don't understand that, but we will get to that in a moment. First, we have to do our brief synopsis.
Brief synopsis.
Okay.
So this movie follows American soldiers and airmen on in the Pacific Theater. The USS Enterprise is prominently displayed, the aircraft carrier. It goes through Pearl Harbor, goes through the Battle of Midway, and the conflict therein with the Japanese naval forces.
That's fair.
Basically it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to say that we are coming at this from two different perspectives, so hopefully that helps you guys get a better picture of this movie if you haven't seen it. So I am someone that knows very little to almost nothing about history. I've obviously picked up things from Tyler along the way, but really, really nothing. So if you don't know anything about history, my perspective might be closer in line to what yours would be. Where his history is Tyler's favorite thing ever, so he already knew pretty much everything. So if you're somebody who really enjoys movies that are historically accurate and portrayed things in a way that you can enjoy, then Tyler's perspective is probably what you're going to want to go with here. So,
I think this movie is a very different perspective than one of the other war movies we've done, 1917, which is more of a journey, Saving Private Ryan type story where there's not a whole lot of historical context, whereas this is very focused on the specifics and what actually happened.
Right. So I will, since you brought that up, I will say that back in 1917 podcast, so if you guys want to know what we talked about then, definitely go back and listen to that one because I'm sure we gave our perspectives then. But back then I had said that one of the things I had enjoyed about that movie is I didn't feel I needed to know that much about history to enjoy it because there wasn't a ton of details that were not within the realm of the film. So that is something in this film that is not the case. You really need to know what's going on to understand, and if you don't, you're going to be confused because they cram a lot of different things in here, and some of it is kind of talked about off cuff, and they don't bring it up again.
Right.
So I had Tyler to kind of say, okay, what does that mean? Where are they going with that? And I could do that. But if you have nobody to ask that to, you are either going to be very confused or you're going to spend a lot of time kind of Googling and trying to figure out what's going on because they don't really give that to you in this film.
Well, right. So having a lot of the background, for me personally, raised the stakes of the movie because I had understood that it was basically we're outmanned, outgunned, our backs against the wall. We're the last thing that stands between the Japanese Navy and Army and them taking over the western half of the country. Like, right. That they could have done things considerably different, right. And history could have changed.
Right. Now, the one criticism I'll give on that front is that for somebody that does not have a very large historical context, I do wish that in movies like this, they focused on one aspect and kind of gave you all the details that you needed and went with that rather than kind of putting in, you know, for example, they put in the Doolittle thing, which is important. However, they didn't really explain and they didn't kind of give you closure to that. It was just kind of like, here, you kind of explained it and then it kind of went away. And right. It was, I read more about it later and I learned more about it. But if you're not going to do that, it's kind of like, okay, I don't understand.
I think that is, for me, one of the failings of this type of movie because they're trying to do a chronological series of events that span a long range of time from Pearl Harbor to Midway and encapsulate everything. But at that same time, it's kind of like painting with a broad brush. You don't actually get the details. Right,
which is important in history. The other part that I was going to say that I wish that they had almost given a separate movie to almost is the beginning where they're talking. They have, I forget his name, but the intel guy.
Edwin Layton.
Yeah, talking to the guy from Japan.
Yes, the Japanese admiral, because there was an exchange where we sent military attaches to foreign countries.
Right, and that's also when he was given the warning to not attack or not put Japan in a corner because 80% of their oil comes from America. Right. So, first of all, I didn't know that, but second of all, there was a lot more to that. I have to assume. I don't know, but I have to assume that there was more to that exchange and there was more to that relationship and more to the breakdown of that relationship than we know. And you explained a little bit to me about how we backed them into a corner and why everything happened, but it really wasn't put in this film. And I feel like that in of itself is something that needed more kind of context.
So it's the driving factor for the Japan's course of action. So when they stopped getting the oil from the United States, they moved to try to capture territory in Indonesia that had oil so that they could continue fighting Australia, China, Korea, etc.
Right. And you explained that. I just feel that was kind of an off-the-cuff thing that happened in this film that could have been better if it was given its own thing. Anyway, that all said,
yes,
cinematography for this film, which we don't talk about a lot when we talk about films, but that I think it stood out in this film.
I feel it did. So the colors were very vibrant. It was very well shot visually. Mm-hmm. So it reminds me of another war movie that I've seen recently, Dunkirk, where there's the great aerial shots and the panoramics, and you get a sense of the scope and the scale of things, where it's just enormous aerial fights and enormous conflict in the very large Pacific Ocean.
Right. Now, people have claimed that the CGI was horrible in this film. Do you agree with that?
Well, admittedly, I didn't notice that, but at the same time, I don't have glasses currently because mine broke. So my vision watching this movie was a little bit fuzzy, so that probably factored into that.
Right. So I did have glasses on. I will say that some of the explosions did give me a Call of Duty type feel, if you know what I mean. Like the kind of like, it's real for a video game type real, but not real for real life type real. Okay. So, but I kind of just accepted that as it was because it's not as important to me as long as the historical context is true. Right. But I mean, I can see that, but that's really the only time that it stood out at all was the actual explosions. Right. So, so half and half, I guess.
I mean, I didn't have any complaints, but then again, I'm not really focused on that at the moment. I feel like it was probably better CGI than Alita Battle Angel for a good portion of it.
Is that a high bar?
No, that's widely criticized as poor CGI. All right, moving on. Where are we going from there?
Okay, so another criticism that's been given is the acting / dialogue / screenplay for this movie. So, I mean, there were some corny lines, as you said. This is for Pearl Harbor is one of them. There are corny lines in this movie. There are definitely parts where, like, for example, Dick Best's accent annoyed the crap out of me. I still don't know where it was supposed to be from, but that kind of stuff didn't bother me overall. Like, I mean, I guess it should have, but it didn't really.
I mean, yes and no, but I'm of the opinion that going into almost every war movie, there's going to be at least a couple ham-fisted lines, and it's just, that's part of the genre. It seems like that is just built into every single war movie, basically ever.
Okay, but something they compare it to would be Saving Private Ryan, where they say that's the writing there is impeccable. Well,
I would argue that that's more the anomaly than the rule, given that there are so many war movies that are done where the writing is more in line with this rather than Saving Private Ryan, which is an exceptional film, which we've also done for the podcast.
So I will give an unpopular opinion and say that I actually almost prefer a little bit of campy, cheesy lines stuffed in there because I'm spending a lot of my time trying to parse out the historical parts, that giving me that break where you're just saying like weird stuff to say stuff gives me time to kind of parse it out and be like, okay, I get it. And also some of those campy lines I think you guys feel is campy because this is for Pearl Harbor or whatever. To you, it's like, well, duh. Where to us, it's kind of like you're hammering it home where you're like, okay,
we're just tying it all together and trying to make it more cohesive. But
right. But it gives us enough kind of like hammer on the nail type thing where you're like, after the third time you've said it, now it's sunk in kind of thing. Right. So it's hard. So from a perspective of someone that doesn't know history, the campy stuff might help you because it kind of grounds you in somewhere that you can understand.
Well, there's just some level of familiarity too. I mean, it goes into all basic other war movies, really.
Right. So I did want to kind of just give like a little bit of the director / the writer, since people are complaining about that. So the director was Ronald Emmerich, I believe his name was. Was it
yes.
Ronald? And he is known for Independence Day, White House Down, and Day After Tomorrow. But a large criticism of his is that his dialogue is generally cliched.
I mean, it is. So he's also known, I believe, for The Patriot with Mel Gibson.
I believe that is true.
So a lot of those movies have just over-the-top, campy dialogue. They just do. They're just kind of
They're also Will Smith movies, some of them, aren't they?
Well, Independence Day.
Independence Day definitely is. I feel like there was another one, too.
Well, Day After Tomorrow is Dennis Quaid.
Okay, so that's...
Yeah, it's the End of the World one.
Yeah, I know what movie you're talking about, but...
But yeah, it's a lot of them are just super over-the-top, campy.
Yeah, and I mean...
A lot of them also have really bad CGI. Maybe he should hire someone new.
Maybe I need to work on that. Also, the writer was Wes Took. This is his first film, or at least the only one I could find on the IMDb filmography. But he has written for TV. The most that he's written for is a TV show called Colony. I've never heard of it. But I kind of look at that and think, writing your first film, let's give him a little bit of a break here. Like, you're not going to come out the gate with a masterpiece unless you're, like, some kind of a prodigy, so...
I mean, even the people that are considered a prodigy for Boondock Saints, the dialogue was terrible.
Right, so I mean...
Terrible dialogue.
Maybe that does add to the problem there. But again, it didn't bother me that much. So, there's that. Okay, so this is going to be the bulk of it because I know you want to talk about this. The movie versus the real story. Where are there discrepancies? Where was it accurate? All of that. So I guess I'm basically going to let Tyler have the floor for about 20 minutes.
I mean, so watching this movie, I was struck by them trying to keep it very faithfully accurate to their chronology, for starting from Pearl Harbor to the Doolittle raid. All of that was thrown in there, and paced based off what happened, I didn't notice a whole lot of wildly out of place idiosyncrasies. On the IMDb, there were a few gaffes that they made where the planes didn't have the right badging and ornamentation for the designations. One of the Jeeps at Pearl Harbor had left driving only which was a World War II thing for England because they drive on the different side of the road.
Gotcha.
And it's just it's not it doesn't mesh with Hawaii because everyone drives on the same side of the road. But for the most part, it was fairly accurate to the real life activity.
Okay, so I mean, there are some discrepancies that I do like to acknowledge that there are discrepancies. So, for example, Halsey did not have shingles. He had eczema, so he wasn't able to like go get cured and then come back because that's not a thing. Also, Dick Best, when he had the lung issue, first of all, it wasn't a bad mix of oxygen. His reheater overheated or something like that.
Well, right. So it's because air that they intake at that altitude is very cold, so they have to make it safe for someone to breathe and not basically frostbite their lungs.
Right. So that happened, and when that happened, he actually had dormant tuberculosis in his lungs, and the nodules of the TB were released into his lungs, and that's why he was sick. He was able to get cured, and he actually lived to 91. Right. So that's kind of crazy.
Also, the submarine that's featured in the film was not firing on on one of the aircraft carriers, the torpedoes. He was firing on a battleship or cruiser, I believe. It was the USS Nautilus, if I'm not mistaken. But for the most part, fairly accurate. This film does a poor job, in my opinion, of comparing the United States aircraft to the Japanese aircraft. While the Zero was considerably better at the start of the war, we quickly outpaced the Japanese after a few years of fighting with our aircraft technology. So we were winning air superiority after this battle. So, I mean, it was kind of one-sided to start with, but then we got better.
Right. So one thing I did want to ask you about, so this is a discussion point, I don't want to say a criticism, but a discussion point online, is the fact that the Japanese were portrayed favorably. Not great, but they were not portrayed as just evil as they are in some movies. And, you know, how do you feel about that? And how do you think they could have done better? Do you think that this movie is an anomaly in that? I just am curious, from somebody who's seen a lot of war movies, how you feel.
I mean, that is entirely fair. So in Hacksaw Ridge, which we've done with the podcast, it was very narrative-based for the Americans, and they were very much just the nameless, faceless enemy. Mm-hmm. That's the case for a lot of movies that feature the Japanese. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head that humanizes them quite a bit more is Letters from Iwo Jima, mm-hmm. which is basically a movie shot from their perspective. So it's very focused on them and the general that is in charge of the last-ditch, last stand right before the Americans start bombing the hell out of Japan.
Right.
And they're realizing that they can't win, but his job is to hold the line for as long as possible to see if we can make them come to the table to negotiate.
Okay. So I haven't seen this movie, but there is a movie kicking around that people are saying does better at humanizing the Japanese, which is called Tora Tora Tora. I know nothing about this movie. I haven't even seen a trailer. I've just seen that people are kicking that around online. I don't know what it's about.
It is a classic. I have not seen it. It's been on my list for a while. I just haven't gotten around to it.
So it'll be on the list. So great. Wonderful. More war movies. Fantastic. But yeah, so for me, I mean, I'm somebody who likes to see two sides to everything. And I believe in the good in literal everyone. And I mean that in the most literal way possible.
She's not kidding. She will find ways to try to understand the worst of human society.
Right. I will. So for me, I really appreciate the fact that they show that the Japanese came from a perspective of not just evil, but a need on their own, and something that they, they also were fighting for their own people, and they were taking care of their own people. I mean, the general, when he decides to go down, or I don't know if it's general, but the person who decides Admiral that decides to go down with the ship, he says the young need to get off the ship. He didn't want them to go down. Now, granted, part of that is because they need people to fight. But also, I do think there is a human aspect of that, of saying you have a life to live. You can't just, give it up for us. It shows that they're people. They're not just these faceless, horrible people. And I appreciate that. I think that's important for us to remember that while the war is a horrible thing and the memory of Pearl Harbor is not great, there was people on that other side. So I do think that's important. And I'm glad that they did that at the end, the credits, where they didn't dedicate this to just the Americans who fought in Pearl Harbor, or Midway, or both. But they also dedicated it to the Japanese. So I thought that was...
Well, we are from the United States, so we have a very clear national identity. The same holds true for every other country. Canada, Japan, Russia, Germany. So while history is written by the winners, and some of the things that were done in war, specifically this war, were horrible, Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, etc., there's not so much that is right or wrong. It's you're fighting for your country, and you're just on the other side.
Right.
So,
I mean, it's hard for us to make a comment about the Japanese side because we don't have a full picture.
Yeah.
One thing, this is completely random, and I don't know why we put it out of order, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was the ability to connect to characters in this, because we do talk about that a lot, about the fact that, at least for me to enjoy a movie, I really have to find somebody that I can connect to and watch them develop. So a criticism of this movie was there was no one in this movie that you could do that with. And I do see a side of that, because for definitely, at least on the American side, everyone was like the same. Like, I started getting confused as to like who died and who didn't. And I'm not trying to say that they weren't individual people in real life, but in the movie they didn't give you enough background. They didn't say their names enough. And they were all the same build, age.
It's the United States military at that time. They're all
like 20-something.
20-something men, 20 to 40.
Right.
And all athletic because they're serving in the military, and
their identities were just the military. Right. They didn't give them backstories. They didn't give them any of that. So,
I mean, with the exception of the one person that had a family, there was no other family moments. There was no other... I mean, the wife kept coming in for Leighton to tell him to stop working, but that was the only other woman in the movie, really.
Right, and even he didn't... That was it. That was the only story he had beyond this. So it was very hard to connect. But I will say that they did at least allow you to connect with Dick Best. And I am appreciative of the fact that they gave him a wife and a child, and they kind of gave that when he was like looking at the picture, when he was like dive bombing, and also like as he was kind of growing in his role of being the lead, he was, putting his family above I'm just gonna do what I need to for my country, but he was also thinking about wanting to come home to his daughter. Yeah. So those type of things were really good, but it was lacking in the ability to connect. I do think that they could have done better in that.
They could. I would say that with his wife specifically, that worked well or better for me receiving it than the love story thrown into Pearl Harbor with Ben Affleck.
I don't know that I've seen the full of that movie. I'm not sure. I don't remember.
But it kind of fell flat because they threw in a love story to throw in a love story, it seemed.
And this one wasn't a love story. He had a wife. Like, that exists.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's just the human reality. So, men and women that serve in war have families. Like, that's, you come from a family, you have a mother, a father, brothers, sisters, a wife, kids.
Right. This wasn't him falling in love with her and like all of that. This was, he had a wife. It existed in the world.
Right. So that's what happens in Pearl Harbor, and it's just kind of like, okay, you threw this in to throw that in. Like, that's, okay, gotcha. Didn't need that.
Right. So, I mean, they could have done better, but at least they didn't do that. But since you're bringing up Pearl Harbor, yes. The actual real life event Pearl Harbor, you wanted to compare and contrast with something that we're more familiar with, which was 9/11.
Well, so I feel that they have a lot of striking similarities because it was a surprise attack and a horrible moment in American history, but they're also very different. So they have the similarity of everyone knows where they were when they were alive, if they were alive for that moment. So you know where you were when Pearl Harbor happened if you were alive during that time. You know where you were when JFK was shot. You know where you were when 9/11 happened. And it's every so often in reality you have that one oh my god moment.
Right. And I think I think for this generation right now, the only thing I can even think of is what we're going through right now. They haven't really experienced any kind of... yes, we've been in a war. Don't get me wrong. We've been in a war, but it hasn't really affected us here in America at this time. So people that were born in, I would say, probably like 2000s and later, this is probably right now in quarantine is what their I'm going to remember moment. For us, obviously, we're born late 80s, early 90s. You're going to remember 9/11 because, right. I mean, there's no one that can say I didn't know where I was that day. That's just crazy.
Well, it's also a little bit different for now, especially because there's no singular moment. It's an ongoing thing.
Right.
It's not, I remember when this happened. It's, I remember the year that we lost in 2020 by staying inside.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, for 9/11 at least, I feel like it was a very stark moment. It was a huge change, and it was a very confusing time. I mean, I was in 8th grade, so it was very confusing because it was just like I didn't understand any of what was happening, and I don't think most people our age really did. And I don't even think as they were giving us the information, they understood what was happening. So, you know, it's crazy to think of that and to think of what people went through during Pearl Harbor as well. I mean, it had to have been a very similar feeling.
It was very much a gut punch and oh my god kind of moment, and I would have to imagine it's that things are bad and we don't even know how bad they are,
right?
Really,
exactly. Okay, so but even though this entire podcast was History Minute, I do believe you have more.
Tyler's History Minute.
So I have a few. This story follows the airmen on a particular aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, not to be confused with the Star Trek version of the Enterprise, but the aircraft carrier, commonly called the Big E. She also has another nickname, the Grey Ghost, because the Japanese thought several times, I think it was 3 or 4 times during this war, that she had been sunk because she sustained heavy damage and was supposed to be out of the fight for months, if not years, for repairs, and they basically patched her up and sent her back out. She is the most decorated U.S. Ship from this war. She served the longest and in the most conflicts. She unfortunately missed the end of the war because she was in dry dock getting refitted when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima. But for the start of the war, and for a period of time, she was the only U.S. aircraft carrier still in active service against the entire Japanese Navy. And I learned a lot of this from research and television on the History Channel. It's a great television documentary series called Battle 360, which does CGI reenactments of all the major battles, Midway, etc. Thoroughly recommend. Let's see. The Yorktown, which is one of the other aircraft carriers that was involved, was sent back to Pearl Harbor for repair just before Midway. They were expected to take 2 to 3 weeks to refit her and make her seaworthy again. It turned her around in either 2 days or 72 hours. Both numbers are thrown out there. So
Dang.
They had sent her back out with repair crews still working away as she was setting sail for Midway.
Wow.
Lastly, or a couple more things. So we did a lot of very good intelligence work throughout this war. I would argue that America and England won the War of Intelligence because the British cracked the Enigma for the Germans and were able to read their coded messages. We did that for the Japanese, and we had the information superiority. So we had known about Japan wanting to attack a major U.S. target, codenamed AF, and they actually sent out a message saying Midway's fresh water was running out because their saltwater desalinization plant was not working, and they heard back that the Japanese were bringing that equipment to AF, so they're like, okay, got it, and we knew where they were. So yeah. And then finally,
lastly,
I know I'm going on and on. This movie ended with a setup for a sequel, essentially, which is the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which is coming out, I believe, in 2022.
It is.
Which has another name. That was probably the most one-sided fight in the entire war, where we shot something like 700 planes out of the sky in a day, and then Japan basically had nothing.
So basically you're giving that information so that when we go to do that movie in 2022, we're not going to have anything to talk about? I have to come up with something else. Cool. Okay, good.
I just thought of one more. You're killing me here. So Bull Halsey, which was in this movie, was also responsible for what could have been a devastating gaffe, where he took the American aircraft carriers to pursue the now empty, useless Japanese aircraft carriers, leaving the landing forces without any support at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And there's a great book about what happens where American destroyers, tiny little ships, have to go up against some of the biggest battleships ever. And they're so outmatched that it's not even funny. It's a tremendous story. And Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, great book.
Okay,
I'm done. I'm done.
All right. So I did have a few as well, since you didn't mention them. One would be when the Doolittle raid happened, they tied a bunch of friendship medals they got from the Japanese to the bombs that they dropped on Tokyo. One of the Doolittle planes also had a picture of Donald Duck on it.
Yes.
So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to mention that John Ford, who was the person filming the movie at the time of Midway, he actually did that. His footage was used for a documentary of Midway, but while there, he suffered a bomb concussion as well as a gunshot wound during the Japanese raid, and he insisted on continuing filming anyway. So I thought that was kind of crazy. And then lastly, I mentioned this to you before, basically it's a request to Hollywood to make another movie, because I come from a journalism background. If you guys don't know that, that's what I majored in college until I gave up and decided it was too competitive. But I really love seeing the journalistic side of things. And there is a person called Stanley Johnson, who was a war correspondent. He was Australian, who mined for gold in New Guinea. He wrote an article for the Tribune, and the article title was Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea. This was released while this whole thing was going on, and it was looked at as basically letting the Japanese know that we were able to crack code, and it was considered, horrible and leaking information. And at the time, he was the only American in history that the government had taken steps to prosecuting a member of the media for espionage.
Right.
And it was kind of like this huge controversy of how he got it. It was assumed that it might have been just left around somehow, which is not good.
Well, it goes to the old expression during the war, loose lips sink ships. So they were very much concerned about people talking at bars and being overheard, and just people would black out all of the coastal cities so they couldn't see, so submarines couldn't see anything, airplanes couldn't take pictures. It was a huge, huge effort to limit the spread of information.
Right. Now, it's said now that the Japanese never actually saw this article and it didn't affect anything, but it was a big deal at the time, and I would be curious to see the journalistic perspective of how he got the information, why he did that, what he was thinking at the time, what he went through when the government was coming after him. I would just be interested to see that perspective.
I mean, the Doolittle raid is a giant, petty, you can go to hell and you can go to hell and die by the Americans after Pearl Harbor.
And there's already a movie on that, yeah?
Well, it was, there's several. It was referenced in Pearl Harbor. They go and do that at the end of the movie. There's been a bunch of movies about that where they basically took U.S. Army bombers, because the Air Force wasn't a thing yet, and put them on an aircraft carrier, stripped all of the weight out of the bomber that you could so that it would not fall off the end of the aircraft carrier, and bombed the hell out of Tokyo.
Goodness. Well, from what I read, that raid did not do much in terms of the war, but it helped morale.
Well, it was a, all right, game on. You want to play? We'll play. And it doesn't matter where you are, how safe you are, or how safe you feel. We will come for you. We will find you. And we will kill you.
Right. Okay, so I'm sure that they got their fill of history, and I will let you guys know that next week is nothing like this, so just stick with us. But there is Audience Asks.
Audience Asks.
Okay.
So, most of it is pretty much condemning the movie. So deal with it. The Countdown podcast. So they actually have a great podcast. They usually do countdowns of top 10 history or top 10 whatever. Top 10 name this year movies. So if you guys need movies or podcasts like that, check them out. But they said, is this the worst Roland Emmerich film yet, or have there been worse?
I mean, there has to be worse. I mean, White House Down is terrible. Day After Tomorrow, also terrible. This is not a terrible movie in my opinion. So, yes, I mean, come on. There are so many worse movies that he's done.
Okay, so, I mean, those are the only movies I know of him. And
I mean, The Patriot, for historical accuracy purposes, The Patriot, for God's sakes. It's one of the least historically accurate movies. I mean, Mel Gibson's on that list a bunch of times with Braveheart and other things, but no, come on.
Okay, so, I mean, I'm assuming that they're going with probably dialogue type stuff and things like that, although I don't know. So, if Countdown Podcast, if you're listening, let us know exactly what it was about this film that you thought was so bad. If we haven't covered it, I would be curious to know. I'm going to actually give the 3 that are here. The next one is just basically so that you mention this. So, Dean Westerman asked, was it as good as the original Charlton Heston version?
I'm embarrassed to admit I've never seen the original.
Did you know it existed before they asked you this question?
I did know that there was a movie based on Midway, yes.
Okay.
Or at least one.
So we have watched the trailer since we saw this question, and you have added it to the list.
It has been added to the list.
You mentioned the cast.
Well, yes, it's got, I believe, Henry Ford and...
I don't remember, but it has a phenomenal cast.
Charlton Heston, and I can't remember the others, but...
So at some point we will do that movie, and at that point we will say which one's better.
We'll have to compare, probably.
Yeah, so
Definitely. Dean
Dean Westerman, since you are a new commenter, if you are already watching, subscribing, all of that kind of stuff, do that. Check our Twitter, and I'm sure it'll be coming because Tyler is obsessed with war movies. Yeah. Okay, live stream for The Cure. So I did want to kind of just make a quick mention that they basically are, they do a live stream, I think it's once yearly, and their proceeds from the live streams benefit cancer. A bunch of podcasters usually come together and participate in this. This year it's on May 27th. So I just wanted to plug that really quickly because they did comment and said, does Ed Skrein give the worst performance in motion picture history in this film? And then he said, yes, the correct answer is.
No, come on. There are so many terrible performances by other actors and Ed Skrein in other movies. So, no, just stop it.
So, I mean, what's a worse performance that you can think of?
Kurt Russell, Big Trouble in Little China. Like, easy answer. Done. There's so many other, come on.
Didn't you mention a movie related to this about code breakers with Nicolas Cage? Was that a worse performance?
Nicolas Cage, Windtalkers, terrible performance. There's just so many other horrible, bad acting performances in movies that are comically bad.
Basically, anything 80s would be on Tyler's list. Basically, any of those campy 80s films,
I'm going to have to compile a list of worst acting performances. There are so many bad performances.
So what I'm hearing is next week, at the beginning of our podcast, we're going to do an intro where Tyler comes to you with a list of 10 performances that are worse than this one.
Yes.
Okay?
10.
One of which has to be an Ed Screen performance.
All right.
Okay?
Game on.
Okay, so if you guys want to hear that, it'll be at the beginning of the next podcast. So that is all of our audience asks.
So I did want to do one last thing, because this is a historical movie. I did want to give the final tallies after the battle.
Okay.
Because it was the tipping point in the war in the Pacific. Up to that point, we're fighting for our lives. So we went in and sunk 4 Japanese carriers in this battle. They lost approximately 300 planes and around 3,000 men. Wow. While the U.S. suffered the loss of 1 carrier and 1 destroyer and 145 planes, but only 360 men. So they went into it with quite a few more resources, and this is now things are more even. We're gonna start going and advancing across the Pacific and winning the long drawn out war. So
okay, sad note. Anyway, ratings.
Reviews.
Ratings and reviews. Rotten Tomatoes has the critic score at 42%.
Oof, yikes.
Which is brutal. Audience score of 92.
Okay.
So the average person really does enjoy this movie. I think this comes down to the...
Our listeners must not be the average person.
Apparently not. But I think it comes down to it's a inspirational movie. It's a go, America can do it. We are going to win at all costs.
Team America.
Movie. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah.
So I think I'm more on that line because I'm a huge history guy, and it was, for the most part, historically accurate, and the characters are compelling, and the real life sacrifices that went into winning this war are just so engaging.
Okay, so
I'm going to give it a solid 8.5.
Okay, that's a really good rating.
So
I was going to give it a 7. I enjoyed the movie as a war movie. I will say that generally speaking, I'm not super into war movies. It takes a certain frame of mind for me to watch them. But I will take away points for the fact that it is not catered to somebody who doesn't have any historical context at all. You literally need to know going into this film. And also that there really aren't a lot of characters to connect with, only one. And even him, you see his daughter like once, maybe twice.
Definitely does not pass the Bechdel test.
And doesn't pass the Bechdel test at all. Not that it was meant to, but it doesn't. And Mandy Moore doesn't have much more than basically she shows up to fight for her husband and then powders her nose when she's concerned for his safety. So it was just kind of like very flat, you know, in the aspects that were not about historical context, which I get it. You history buffs like that. But there are more to war stories than what happened at war. They did have families. They did have lives. They are people. And I do appreciate acknowledging that. So that's why I'm going to give it a 7. So anyway, that is everything for this movie, I think.
Yeah, we went on a decent amount of time. So
yeah, so sorry about that. Next week, we are changing gears a little bit because we've done a lot of heavy movies. And I wanted to make sure that we don't just bombard you with heavy movies.
Also, our choices are very limited for new movies given the current state of the world.
Yes. So I don't even know what new movies are going to look like going forward. We're still going to try to do one a month. I don't know what that's going to look like. However, there is new releases on Netflix. Very few of them. And we chose The Wrong Missy, which is going to be on Netflix. I know it has David Spade. And it releases the day that this podcast uploads, which is May 13th. So if you guys want to watch it before the podcast comes out, it's released.
It's available.
It's released, and you can do that. Right. So check that out on Netflix. It's free. One of the few free movies we do, and it looks like it's just a rom-com. It's silly. It's whatever. We haven't read anything about it. We've seen a trailer. That's it. Right. So come back for that. If you want to talk to us outside the podcast, I am on Twitter at cinematicallyc. Tyler is Blame Tyler CC. You can email us cinematicallycorrect@gmail.com. You can find us other ways if you type in cinematically correct, but those are your best methods to find us. Audience Ask does come out generally between Saturday and Sunday, depending on when we sit down and watch the movie. So if you want to contribute to those, look for them, or just tweet at me and tell me that you've got something you want us to talk about. I don't know what you're going to want us to talk about in the wrong Missy, but maybe like there's some, I don't know. I have no idea what the movie's about, so we will see. But anyways, thank you to Jake Get Out This Music for our intro and outro music, and we will be back next week with The Wrong Missy.
Thank you all for listening.